My subject draws from work in progress. It is broad, and my presentation sets a very wide perspective. Its title, Reflecting Upon Knowledge, as the philosopher Daniel C. Dennett tells us, as far as we can tell, man is the only species with the capacity to think about what he is thinking. The only species to draw values. My purpose is to show how Hayek's early and highly original work as a research student in psychology in the 1920s shaped his method for what was to follow as social theory. Let us consider the nature of originality, and perhaps I can start with Peter Ustinov and a school report which stated that he shows great originality, which must be originality is often not appreciated. Original ideas, by definition, they simply emerge. In practical terms, there is an infinite regress, which is the relevance of my first two citations here. The first from Karl Popper and John Eccles. Observations themselves would not even exist if there was no previous knowledge which they could modify. And from Hayek, we must be able to find all that we can understand in our own mind. We can understand only what is already familiar. We can act confidently only when we can take our bearings, when we have a firm touch upon our base. And this applies as much to oneself in a physical world as to the social interaction between individuals, which is the relevance of the third citation, also from Hayek. We all constantly act on the assumption that we can interpret other people's actions on the analogy of our own mind. We use analogy to understand the behavior of others. We assume that others are a lot like ourselves. But the use of analogy and metaphor is much broader. Here I present Jonathan Miller, who draws upon broad experience. As art historian, comic actor, comedy writer, film director, gallery curator, historian of science, lecturer, neuropsychologist, opera director, painter, physician, sculptor, television presenter and producer, theatre director, and historian. I don't know what he did in the afternoons. Here he points to suggestive metaphors which he describes as, quote, the most impressive contribution to the growth of intelligibility. The particular examples which he gives here relate to his work as a physician, the pump and the gun turret, giving insight into the function of the heart and muscle movements, respectively. Evolution provides the most general of metaphors, and arguably it is the biggest idea there is. I give you Richard Dawkins, Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, who asks, if superior creatures from space ever visit Earth, the first question they will ask in order to assess the level of our civilization is, have they discovered evolution yet? John Eccles, who received the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1963 for his work on nerve cells, describes evolution as one of the greatest conceptual achievements of man. And Daniel C. Dennett, director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University, the best idea anyone has ever had. Evolution is the idea that entities adapt to other entities, leaving themselves better placed, more comfortable, and more durable. Henry Plotkin, Professor of Psychobiology at the University College London. He argues for an alternative to evolution as a descriptive label, namely what he calls, quote, universal adaptationism. This, he argues, better conveys the idea that everything becomes adjusted to everything else and avoids the Victorian connotation of evolution as advancement. Universal adaptationism has the neutral connotation of constant readjustment. And Plotkin argues that any end-directive adaptive action constitutes understanding, knowledge in the broadest sense. Plotkin argues that all adaptations are knowledge. The fleshy, water-conserving cactus stem constitutes a form of knowledge of the scarcity of water in a world of the cactus. Lacking a brain of any kind, the cactus has its knowledge built upon a less complex structure of genes and development. Plotkin's terminology is that a primary heuristic, instinct, handles events that are repeated within the generational dead time. The generational dead time is the period between conception and reproduction, between receiving and passing a genetic code. We are programmed to survive. The secondary heuristic, intelligence, deals with problems of an unfamiliar future. Intelligence tracks events that are too rapid for the primary heuristic. And the tertiary heuristic is the guidance we receive from a cultural inheritance. Now, it seemed to me that Plotkin's characterization parallels that made in the opening chapter of Hayek's Fatal Conceit. The chapter title is Between Instinct and Reason. And between instinct and reason is located the received wisdom of custom and practice as it's handed down. Of course, my particular focus is Hayek's application of universal adaptationism, but that is a clumsy word, so I will stick to evolution. Hayek's application of evolution to a theory of the mind and to a theory of human society. And the two are linked. In regard to my own energies, a paper on Hayek's sensory order was published in the journal Theory and Psychology almost 5 years ago. And that has become the basis for the first new chapter of a rewrite of my book on Hayek's Economics, published in 1993. And that book was published last month, and my publishers, had they been reliable, would have provided some flyers with a discount offer. But if anybody is interested, they can let me know of their interest, and I'll make sure that they receive a flyer in due course. Hayek's Sensory Order is a seminal work, which is another word for original. It is a work that only recently is receiving due recognition, but which is central to understanding Hayek's work generally. The sensory order anticipates developments in neurology, psychology, and in artificial intelligence research, and it is relevant to social theory. Hayek's mind theory contrasts with that of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes refuses to clutter what he assumes to be the finite capacity of his brain space. He has a self-imposed ignorance in order that he should not overfill what he regards as the pigeonholes of his brain. Sherlock Holmes's concept of the human mind is analogous to the memory store of digital computing. The file space is limited. The Sherlock Holmes theory of the mind invokes the notion of the grandmother cell. The grandmother cell is a parody for arguments against one-to-one coding, against the idea that a unique neuron represents a unique object, that one's grandmother, and the memory of her, rather, is stored in a single location in the brain. That is my grandmother. On her 18th birthday in 1899. I don't know what she'll say to me. Hayek's first crucial insight came in rejecting the notion of the grandmother cell. And he writes at the beginning of the sensory order, "What I had from the beginning been unable to swallow was the conception that a sensory fiber could carry, or a nerve cell store, those distinctive attributes that we know mental phenomena to possess." Even so, recent work sets place the grandmother cells of a kind as a theoretical limit to what is known as sparseness. This is the idea that at later processing stages, neurons become increasingly selective for combinations of features. But I'm going to leave that to the psychologists. So we might recognize two paradigms: the Sherlock Holmes theory of the mind, digital computing, and Friedrich Hayek's theory of the mind. Two paradigms with mutual compatibility, with the former, Sherlock Holmes, and the grandmother cell, as a limiting form of the latter. So we have Hayek's mind theory, which introduced the paradigm which is known as Connectionism. And the idea is that neural connections are strengthened as they are used. And particular connections are used with greater frequency when they serve a purpose, in leaving an individual better placed, or more comfortable, or more durable, his survivability. Connectionism has very wide and general application. Gerald Edelman's work on artificial intelligence is especially notable. Gerald Edelman acknowledges Hayek's seminal thesis. As he says, the essence of his analysis still remains with us. Missed my cue there, I apologize. Edelman's analogy, the metaphor that he chooses to put across the idea, is that memory is more like the melting and freezing of a glacier. Edelman's glacier metaphor admits to no distinction between our memory of past events and our continuous mental engagement with present events. Past events set our understanding of the present, and present events alter our understanding of the past. There is no beginning and there is no end. And it strikes me that these features are akin to Otto Neurath's metaphor for the development of knowledge. That it is possible to rebuild a boat whilst it is at sea. But you can only rebuild that boat one plank at a time. And there is no hint in regard to the origin of the boat or to its eventual configuration. Seems to me the analogy is there. Edelman's description of memory as a form of constructive recategorization during ongoing experience fits Friedrich Hayek's own representation of mental properties as, quote, the place of an impulse in a system of relations between neurons, and Hayek's representation of the central nervous system as, quote, a process of continuous and simultaneous classification and constant reclassification. The description that Hayek gives, a process of continuous and simultaneous classification, parallels Edelman's description of a network that, quote, recreates and revises past and present associations. The implication that can be drawn from these descriptions is that whenever familiar items are revisited, the representation is never the same. A thought is always unique. It is never recalled in precisely the same way. Hayek's sensory order was published in 1952, and it originates from a student manuscript, which I understand is to be published in the next volume of the collected writings of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek explains the circumstances of his work in the introduction to the sensory order. He found himself working during a period of university shutdown during a bleak winter in the laboratory of a brain anatomist. And he describes himself as having felt that he'd found the answer to an important problem, but that he could not explain precisely what that problem was. 25 years later, he identified the problem in the questions, what is mind, and what determines the difference between different sensory qualities. By Hayek's own recognition and judgment, the sensory order is at the center of his social theory. He regarded it as, quote, the most important thing I have yet done. More important, to be among the more important contributions to knowledge, the insights I gained both from the first stage in 1920 or later in the 1940s were probably the most exciting things that occurred to me and which shaped my thinking. So it must have been extraordinarily disappointing to him, as Ralph Harris reports in writing Hayek's obituary, that Hayek should have felt that nobody understands it. The general relevance of the sensory order is that in psychology and in social theory, the same metaphor is applied in describing the structural processes that constitute the mental order of the mind and the social order of mankind, and in describing the evolutionary dynamics of neurological processes, the psyche, and mutual changes of all kinds, our society. Both for an individual mind and for society, order emerges from interaction between constituent elements. Order is, quote, determined by the regularity of the actions towards each other of the elements of a structure. Order emerges from interaction between constituent elements. The further relevance of the sensory order to social theory shows in Hayek's discussion of scientific method. Publication in the same year as publication of the sensory order, The Counter-Revolution of Science. Hayek's discussion of scientific method points to the fact that physical science is independent of history. The speed of light is not contingent upon historical context. By contrast, memory is critical to all evolutionary systems, to psychology, to social theory, to all aspects of the human condition. History is relevant. I collect cartoons, mostly political cartoons. I invite their victims to sign their cartoons. And the general positive response that I receive supports the observation that it is better to be lampooned than to be ignored. A good cartoon says a great deal with very little. This is a good cartoon. It was chosen for a Royal Mail postage stamp. The cartoonist is a man called Mel Kalman. Doctor, do you have something for the human condition? If only it were that simple. I need to make a brief side comment to take note of important differences in evolutionary timescales. Biological evolution is protracted. Some would argue that it's now stationary. Social evolution is rapid. And this means that our deep-seated psychological dispositions are the result of natural selection against events and conditions that are long past. So that our behavioral characteristics are largely atavistic. They are a legacy of evolved traits that are no longer relevant. This has been described, Henry Plotkin, as the thesis of ancient provenance. We have inherited dispositions and phobias whose relevance is long gone, not only in regard to our fear of open spaces or to dark places, but also in our natural sense of social justice in terms of outcomes. And the practicality of this notion of social justice, as Hayek argues, is limited to small groups, and we are no longer actors within small groups. As Daniel C. Dennett says, we notice things that mattered most to the reproductive success of our ancestors. In this context, Hayek notes that many of our innate psychological dispositions are incompatible with an extended socio-economic order. And so those innate dispositions must be constrained. Although we still share most of the emotional traits of primitive man, he argues, the obedience to learnt rules has become necessary to restrain those natural instincts which do not fit into the order of the open society. In focusing upon human understanding in its psychological dimensions and in its social dimensions, Hayek's ontological presumption is that a material world exists, of which the mind is a part. He describes three orders. There is a physical order. There is the neural order of the brain, which is part of the physical order. And there is the sensual order, which is the mind, our psyche, who we are. And drawing upon analogy, I would suggest, and have suggested in the article I referred to, that these three orders might be viewed as analogous to a composer's vision, which we can categorize as the inaccessible truth. Only the composer has direct contact with his vision. Then we have the orchestra with its musical score, which are the media of communication. And then we have the symphonic performance, which is a subjective experience unique to one listener. And within this, the instrumental notes might be seen to parallel the individual neural engagements. For a man in a society, the basic questions are: how does our knowledge grow? How do we anticipate the reactions of others? And how do we decide upon our reaction to others? Well, the answers are that we use any method that conveys information. Just like the melt and the freeze of the glacier, our minds are altered continuously by our presence in a material world, as sensory phenomena are continuously updated as responses to sensory information, as their usefulness is tested by experience, and as neurons and their connections become differentially strengthened through their repeated use. But there is no asymptote of definitive knowledge. Although we drive towards a truth, we are constrained by inherent capacities. We have no way of knowing what it's like to be a bat. The knowledge of every species is species specific. It's relevant to its own survival in its particular environment. We cannot know definitively what it's like to be another person, though we have reason to believe that introspection gives keen insights. And we cannot know definitively how our mind functions, because we have to use our mind in order to understand our mind. So our knowledge is necessarily speculative, partial, and problematic. Our knowledge derives from our genetic makeup, from parental guidance, from formal instruction, from established science, and from successful existence. Human understanding is embodied in an analogous fashion by the mind, serving to protect an individual, and by the social framework, serving to protect individuals. The mind creates, is an individual. The social framework creates, is culture and society. Culture, the social framework, coordinates our decisions, inhibits our decisions, and informs our decisions. In setting the matrices of spontaneous developments, mutual adaptations shape categorizations and associations as they are embedded in the mind as its response to sensory stimuli, and as they are embedded in social institutions as they incorporate rules for behavior. The mind and the social framework are self-organizing, spontaneously involving, open adaptations. A sensory experience is defined, is categorized by neurological relationships. This is the sensory order. An individual is defined, is identified by social relationships. This is the social order. Both the mind and the social framework economize upon, make best use of, incomplete information. The mind has evolved to know what it needs to know. So, for example, eating is better than not eating. Sleeping is better than not sleeping. Gerald Edelman's explanation is in terms of a deep-seated neurophysiological structure, which he calls the value system, which he argues projects over the entire cortex. The social framework has also evolved to make effective use of the partial and dispersed knowledge of what Hayek frequently refers to as the particular circumstances of time and place. So we see the general theme in the parallels, in the analogous details of the respective functions of the mind and the social framework. So let me ask you, which of these two citations strike you as the genuine one, and which has been fabricated on the basis of the other one? Is it the first, taken from the sensory order? Individual neurons are merely the foci in the network of relationships, and it is the multiple interplay of impulses between neurons which forms the recurrent, recognizable, and familiar events of the social structure, of the structure. Now, is that from the sensory order? Or individuals are merely the foci in the network of relationships, and it is the various attitudes of the individuals towards each other which forms the recurrent, recognizable, and familiar elements of the structure? Is that the genuine citation from the Counter-Revolution of Science? Both publications, 1952. It is only by previous deliberate repetition that I remember that it is the second citation which is genuine. Maybe the first. I assure you one of them is genuine. Hayek's subjectivism is set firmly within this general evolutionary framework. Understanding is determined by evolved capacities, by knowing what it is necessary to know in order to survive, by acquiring effective knowledge, and by the effective use of knowledge. In every aspect, what a given species and a given individual of that species needs to know is unique. There is no definitive knowledge. Moreover, particular material circumstances cannot be matched with particular patterns of behavior. Hayek's subjectivism recognizes commonalities across individuals that provide us with a rationale for general precepts, for education, and for social institutions generally. Yet there is a uniqueness in each individual, and that uniqueness delivers a critical conclusion for a system of justice. Hayek argues there is no metaphysical self against which we can compare any actual disposition that we have. And because of that, there can be no mitigation of sentencing upon the basis of extenuating circumstance. Not everyone is brutalized by brutal circumstances. To admit extenuating material circumstances would, in Hayek's words, destroy the chief device which society has developed to assure decent conduct, which is the pressure of opinion that makes people observe the rules of the game. Hayek's subjectivism insists that in order to understand human behavior, we must understand what an individual thinks about objective circumstances. And Hayek sets this against what can be known by the objective methods of science. However, this does raise a problem, because when everything is mediated through a unique brain, everything must be known subjectively. So there is a difficulty in the distinction between Hayek's an objective fact and Hayek's a subjective phenomena, between the laws of nature as they are generally acknowledged in any contemporary society and those that figure in the works of the natural scientists. Hayek writes, if the current scientific knowledge of society which we study included the belief that the soil will bear no fruit till certain rites or incantations are performed, this would be quite as important for us as any law of nature which we now believe to be correct. But belief in certain rites or incantations does not exclude the possibility of their having material worth. Action initiated to appease a pagan deity is more likely to be retained if it is associated with some sign that the gods are pleased. Deities might welcome gifts of fish, subjective belief. Fish might enhance soil fertility, objective fact. Or both, or neither. The general problem is that there is no objective position. There is no definitive scientific rigor. Inescapable problems arise from this absence of definitive criteria for objective scientific rigor. Structures and events are accessed through the mind. Objective methods are corrigible. Data are theory-laden. Theories are creations of the mind. And there is no sharp distinction between lay and scientific explanations. But this is a general issue. It is not a Hayekian issue. In regard to subjectivism, Hayek's position might be summarized in three parts. The first is that individuals have a common mental structure. People perceive the world and each other through sensations and concepts which are organized in a mental structure common to all of them. Second, social science must use introspection, which is irrelevant to physical science. Social science is different in that it, quote, can explain human action in a way we cannot with physical phenomena, with meaning that is not applicable to physical phenomena. And thirdly, subjective implies that a common mental structure permits differences of perspective and opinions. Quote, knowledge and beliefs, while possessing that common structure which makes communication possible, will yet be different and conflicting in many respects. Scientism receives particular criticism from Hayek. Scientism is the misguided belief that social phenomena may be accessed directly. It is motivated, he argues, by a fear of subjective concepts, and it succumbs to the collective prejudice of treating social phenomena as if they were objects directly perceived by us as wholes. And this is directed as much at Keynesian economics as it is against social political theory. So to conclude, Hayek's theory of complex phenomena catches the dynamics of adaptive processes as they relate to the human condition, to an individual's unique understanding and to the social order that exists between individuals. The spontaneity of adaptive processes allows inconsistencies to be reconciled so that interaction is coordinated in respect of the sensory impulses of the mind and of individuals in mutual engagements. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Professor Steele.
You talked about subjective versus objective fact, and it seemed to be that you were talking about fuzzy borders, but I wonder if you maintain the position that a fuzzy border means there's no border, or just that there is a border, that there's a...
The question is there a distinction between objective and subjective knowledge? Is that my understanding of what you're saying, or whether the border sort of exists but cannot be...
I guess my question concerns fact, perhaps.
Yes.
And I know you're using the term knowledge.
I have another collection, which is citations. And I will answer you with one that I cite often from that collection. It's from David Henderson, who worked as an OECD economist for many years. And he talks about facts. And the citation, more or less verbatim as I remember it, is, "Facts do not exist in a vacuum. They merely embellish the assumptions that we make about reality." So I think my answer to you is that there is no border. But the methods which we use as objective physical science are not contingent upon history. So the change is not continuous there in our understanding. There is change, there is scientific revolution. We have Newton for 400 years and then we have Einstein. But there is the difference that it's not contingent upon history, whereas social and psychological development is contingent upon events in the past. Am I picking the questionnaires?
The pioneering psychologist Jean Piaget was a contemporary of Hayek, and his developmental psychology and Hayek's subjectivism seem to be elaborations on each other's ideas, and I was wondering if you could comment on the intellectual and even personal relationship between the two.
Can I comment upon the intellectual and personal relationship between Hayek and others of his contemporaries? The answer is no. I defer to your professionalism as a psychologist, and maybe you could inform me of one or two facts that I ought to be aware of. But what seems to me to be the case, I think Donald Hebb published work simultaneously with Hayek's Sensory Order around the time of 1950. And the question that I have unanswered in my mind is if Hayek had published in 1920 rather than in 1950, whether he would have got more due recognition as a psychologist than he currently enjoys, which is virtually none.
Jerry, you mentioned Richard Dawkins.
Yes.
In your talk, and it occurred to me there's a pretty strong common denominator between Dawkins' thinking and Hayek's thinking, especially when Dawkins applies his ideas on evolution to social order. But Dawkins seems to be unaware of Hayek or the connection of Hayek. Do you have any observations about that?
The question suggests that the work of Richard Dawkins and that of Hayek overlap to some extent, and whether I'm aware of whether Richard Dawkins is alert to Hayek's existence. Well, I do know that he is alert to Hayek's existence because I've sent him stuff. I've had little in the way of response. I greatly admire Dawkins' writing skills, but I find what I would describe as the arrogance of his position difficult at times. He's not a good communicator, as Gerald was saying to me earlier, who's enjoyed a TV schedule with Richard Dawkins. But
Could I ask a follow-up then? I have heard, I can't say where, that he has socialist leanings.
Dawkins,
Is that true or not?
I haven't heard that. I would not claim to know what his political leanings are. I don't know if anybody in the audience is aware of Richard Dawkins' political leanings, but I certainly am not. No, I'm sorry. Thank you.
I just wondered if Hayek dealt with this question, which is, if everything is an interpretation, then isn't his own analysis an interpretation? But he seems to be putting it forward as this is the objective reality of the mind. How does he deal with that self-referentiality?
Interpretations of interpretations of interpretations are always an issue. We always get involved with infinite regress whenever we talk about cause. And we've all dealt with the child who asks, Dad, why did A happen? Well, because B happened. And so why did B happen? Well, because C happened. And what about C? Why did C happen? Will you be quiet? I mean, it's an obvious point, but Sir John Hicks articulated it when he says all cause is down to an exogenous variable that we can't explain. So all of our scientific theory of cause is founded upon the unknown. So we always, the infinite regress is something we just have to live with. It's the riddle of life itself. An infinite regress. At what point did life begin?
Doctor, your explanation is beautiful and complete.
Thank you.
But for me, there's an opening there. What about the human soul? Is it all an interaction of neurons? There's no objective truth. The human mind is not capable of objective reality. I think that's a big empty space in the Hayek's philosophy.
You've asked me a question about the human soul. I think that's the most difficult question that anybody could ever be asked. But I'm currently reading Daniel C. Dennett's most recent text, whose title escapes me, but it deals with determinism and the argument that everything ultimately must be physically determined. And the title has come to me now. It's called Freedom Evolves. That human freedom, human choice must be set in the evolutionary context as a means by which we enhance our survival propensities. That if it's all down to physical equations and determinate systems, then there is no advantage in having the development of intelligence and the freedom to choose, because that is a way of enhancing our survivability. Now, it doesn't answer the question in terms of the soul, but it answers the question in terms of a scientific context, which is that of evolution. Well, I haven't finished the book yet.
Jerry, you pointed out that Hayek thought this was one of his most important contributions to knowledge, and yet bemoaned the fact that people didn't understand it. But in his later work, it doesn't appear that he characterizes his later work with reference back to the sensory order. In other words, he doesn't characterize it as an elaboration on or explication of the sensory order. I mean, is that true, and why do you think that's true? It seems like he himself dropped the book.
Yes, it's an interesting question, the why and the wherefore of the book itself. He claims to have written the sensory order to regain some academic respectability, which he felt that he'd lost in the publication of The Road to Serfdom. And whether that was a relatively easy exercise for him, given the existence of the manuscript, and insofar as I have looked at that original manuscript, I've only had it for a matter of a couple of weeks, but the essence is there. And maybe he just saw that as a one-off, and then he got on with his political theory, and then maybe in retrospect he saw the influence of the sensory order in his own writings without necessarily being consciously aware of that fact as he was doing it. But it's, it's one question to ask somebody else, why did you do that? But sometimes when I ask that question of myself, why did I do that? I don't have a ready answer. So it is difficult sometimes to find a motivation in one's own actions that is not an ex post rationalization. It's a hard one to unfold that.
How would you compare Hayek's theory of mind with more recent theories by Daniel Dennett, such as in Consciousness Explained, and Steven Pinker in How the Mind Works?
I've read Dennett. I've only sketchily knowledge of Pinker. I don't see any great conflict in the paradigms there. None at all. They seem to be following the same kind of remit.
Right. I don't think Dennett has the same kind of social structure in mind.
No.
In his organization.
No.
It seems to be the same kind of.
Sure.
Your remarks triggered in me an idea for a new research program or a new initiative. There is this field called bioeconomics or economic biology, and there are certain analogies between biology and economics. For example, the wolf-deer ratio would be equivalent to the ERE or equilibrium from the neoclassicists. And there's competition between firms in economics and competition between species in biology. I was very interested in Roger's point about Dawkins being possibly a socialist. And it seems that the new initiative would be to try to convert all those guys because they have the ERE and the competition idea, and all they have to do is apply it to an area that they're not used to applying it to, namely economics. But I think it'll be an uphill struggle because I noticed that the sociobiologists are very politically correct. They don't even dare call themselves sociobiologists anymore. They now call themselves evolutionary psychologists for fear of offending feminists. And yet their theory is very much undermining all of the feminist views that, males and females are the same. According to this biology stuff, there's great differences between the genders. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that new initiative idea.
The question is focused upon bioeconomics and the similarities that are being thrown up and the fear of political correctness and so on and so forth. Well, from Hayek, biology and social theory are dealing with complex systems. And so the same method would be relevant to complex systems wherever they're to be found. So I wouldn't find it surprising that there are commonalities and there is a place for the exchange of ideas and to see where those commonalities can go together. It wouldn't surprise me if Richard Dawkins, thinking to the previous question, had socialist tendencies, because as Hayek says, and as anybody be willing to admit, that Richard Dawkins is a very intelligent man, and Hayek says the thing about sociologists is they do, as socialists, is they do tend to be highly intelligent. He says, but the trouble with intelligent people is that they tend to overvalue intelligence. Gerard, you had a question.
I asked this question with some trepidation, Jerry, because I have not read the sensory order, but reflecting on what you were saying, I was just thinking that while I appreciate the significance of the sort of general adaptation method expressed by Hayek in this work, it seems to me that I see echoes here that the relationship between Hayek and Popper and the Popperian theory, philosophy of science, is coming through. And I would put this to you as a possible point for consideration, picking up on the point made here about self-referentiality. And it's this. The very title itself, the sensory order, seems to me to blur the distinction between sensation or perception on the one hand and intellection or conception on the other. Let me give you an example. It is obviously true, I would think, that we perceive, perception takes place according to the needs, desires, and interests of the receiver. So, for example, just to take, now it's coming up to lunchtime. I'm very sensitive to smell. So the smell of food is attraction. After I've had my lunch, the smell of food is still there, but now it's a distraction and indeed perhaps even nauseating. Okay, so that's relevant to my own particular needs, desires, and interests. If you look at conceptual matters, for example, if you're a teacher and you're teaching addition to students, each individual student's conception is unique to that student. Let's say, so you're teaching them, say, that 7 plus 5 equals 12. Every student's understanding is that student's understanding and not another student's understanding. But the object of their understanding, that 7 plus 5 equals 12, is identical. It's not, in other words, it's the same truth which is apprehended. Now, to relate that then to the difference in methodology between, say, Mises and Hayek in this, it really comes down to this. The most exciting thing about Mises and indeed the Austrian school generally is the whole thing of praxeology for me. That's the thing that gets me excited, right? The first 150 pages, hey, I have to walk around after 10 pages. You know, I have to carry that around with a brown paper cover on it, right? That's the kind of work that is. It's intellectually exciting, and the idea here, the core of the idea is this, right? While the subjectivity of it, the subjectivism is that what I value is unique to me, is specific to me, that nobody can tell in advance what valuations I have, how it will be done. The market is, if you like, the emergent product of the competition and association and all of this sort of thing. Nonetheless, right, there is a discernible objective structure which is permanent and isolatable, okay, so that man acts. Right? As St. Thomas Aquinas had put it, that human beings choose sub ratione boni under the essence of the good. Aristotle, that whatever human beings seek, they seek the good in. Okay, and that again, while the good for each individual is unique and specific, right? That they seek the good and that they must do so, and that it is inconceivable that they should do otherwise. That is like 7 plus 5 equals 12. That is the objective fact which necessarily is maintained. So, just to come to the question, how is your business?
Hell, I thought I was going to have to repeat that.
All of that being said, but not again. I don't see in your presentation, and I'm relying on that because I don't know this, I don't see in your presentation that Hayek can accommodate what to me are those sort of basic facts.
I hope this isn't meant as a cheap shot, but 7 plus 3 equals whatever you said it was equal to. That is mathematics, and that is not fact. That is like music. That is like a musical score. It is an instrument by which we can which we attempt to understand objective facts in physical sciences, in chemistry, and so on and so forth. The mathematics per se is not an object. It is a means of communicating about objects. Now Hayek is strong on there being objective facts. His ontology is the belief that there is a physical world out there, there are things out there. But the understanding is there is never ever going to be any direct access to those objective things. We only have the workings of the 5 senses and the coordination of those sensory impulses, which creates these networks of neurological connections by which somehow, and nobody has an explanation of consciousness, and maybe consciousness and the soul go together, but we don't have the explanation of the self. But we have the ontology which says, yes, we believe those objects to exist. And these are the problems which are thrown up when we can only access them indirectly, and we can only talk about our subjective truths. But given that we are from the same culture, we've had a similar kind of education, we talk the same language, we're more likely to reach agreement than if we were from different cultures, or from different species, or from a different set of circumstances and environment. That is my understanding of Hayek's position, rightly or wrongly.
Thank you.